Joseph Yacoub.
Yes. It's 11:06. Okay. I'm very much interested in Shakespeare, and I don't claim I know much about him, but I always try. So this is taking it from Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and how the Tempest teaches us broadening education. I prefer to read. If I talk, I get distracted. Inspired by Julia Kristeva, thought in her book The Sense and the Nonsense of Revolt, and Charles Dickens' style in his book A Tale of Two Cities, I would like to start my presentation, though with pessimistic lines, but also with the certainty that the essence of humanity is unconquerable by historical and psychological events. It is on this essence that I rely on broadening education. Without considering this essence, we all can fall into the trap of saying, it is the time of normalization, it is the time of the dominance of images, it is the time of the power enveloped by spiritual vacuum, it is the time not of faults but of damages, it is the time not of responsibility but of liability. It is the time not of crime and punishment, but the time of delaying techniques. It is the time of scapegoat rather than the time of guilt. It is the time of chaos that has become media friendly. And finally, it is the time of medialized cases that have become a sort of entertainment catharsis of the citizens' non-existent guilt. Though it is the time of pervertible order, I have no doubt that the spiritual possibilities of humanity will ever take precedence. Rightly, Sophocles says that the human beings are the most destructive and the most wonderful creatures. Humanity is wonderful. That is why we have people like Shakespeare and his likes still existing among us in their incontestable literature to guide humanity. With such a presence, broadening education is possible because, as Aristotle and John Dewey teach us, that education is first for life and then for jobs and other services. How do we see this in Shakespeare's The Tempest? In their most recent book, Shakespeare Staging the World, J. Bates and D. Thornton, 2012, this year, tell us that Shakespeare teaches us how to transform our insights. Like Sophocles, Shakespeare is more interested not in what human beings are, but in what they ought to be. Isn't that what education must be concerned with? In Shakespeare's plays, Bates and Thornton tells us distant places and distant times were brought into a lively dialogue with the present. And I think in response to your question, Richard, Proust continued what Bergson said in his 6th volume of À la recherche du temps perdu. It is a holistic dialogue where the human beings accept each other as human beings, irrespective of their differences. Human beings must define humanity must define herself by humanity, not by her differences. Why emphasizing the superficial when the essential is clearly available to us? We are all a human being. Is it difficult to understand? It's not difficult, it's very simple. We don't have to talk about it even. During the Shakespearean time, Despite the Eurocentric attitude, people were interested in the question of origin. That is the issue of continuity. The discovery of the New World was a source of fear, cultural indigestion, as well as fascination. Different attitudes were blended together. The desire for empires and economic profit, a sense of superiority over the new discovered lands, and exploitation rather than services. Contrasting with these attitudes, great minds like Shakespeare and Montaigne, it's worth noting that it was discovered lately in 2012 that one of the main influences on Shakespeare was Michel de Montaigne. And I think if we want to read Shakespeare, we need to read Montaigne with him too. Montaigne desired to transform the viciousness of exploitation into a totality of spiritual self that is capable of containing psychological personalities in humane individuals. This is well expressed in the proverbial statement uttered by the simple soul of Miranda, who never knew an academic curriculum. O brave new world that has such people in it. This new world is brave because it has such humans who have their own desires, duties, and proverbs that order their experiences and form their ethos. Shakespeare teaches us how to interpret our situations that we may look at them with dignity rather than with an exploitative attitude. Caliban, the character in the Tempest, the creature who is described by Prospero as one who does not have the dignity of the human shape, and also described by Sebastian and Trincolo as a monster with a fishy smell, is presented by Shakespeare as a helpful person who is ready for services to the visitors of his island. The natives were considered either slaves or prizes. Stefano describes this exploitation attitude in Act 2, Scene 2. When they do not, I quote, when they do not give a doit is a Dutch money at that time. When they do not give a doit to relieve a beggar, they will lay out 10 to see dead Indian. Also, the invaders never hesitated to make a point that the natives must be grateful for the education they are receiving from them. Prospero makes Caliban feel that he owes him his language education, and Caliban replies, "And my interest is to know how to curse you. If you teach me this my language, this is my interest, I know how to curse." So, how real is this, considering how people throughout history reacted to the colonizers? Yet, as I mentioned before, no matter how destructive our attitudes could be, humanity can be eclipsed. Cannot be eclipsed. The innocent Miranda continuously mediated between Caliban and her father Prospero. And Prospero, despite his apparent maliciousness, uses his creative illusions to pave the way for love and forgiveness. Additionally, the wise Gonzalo, who saved Prospero and Miranda from the conspiratorial evil of his brother Antonio, utters the most peaceful and unifying words. "For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate, letters should not be known, Riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contact, successions, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, wine, or oil. No occupation. All men idle. All, and women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty. The focus of this quotation is purity and innocence as the prerequisites to all what virtues could come with after. Within the play's context, I firmly believe that Shakespeare means that the essence of humanity is embodied in Miranda's purity and innocence. Purity and innocence seems a utopia for us, but as essence, they would not eclipse the human superficialities that act as the contents of the nobility of the human spiritual form. Montaigne, in his essay on cannibals, teaches us that human beings cannot call others barbarians unless they reflect on how much themselves they could also be barbarians. And if this context, purity and innocence, points to the maxim, know thyself, this is exactly what could mean transformation of our insight. Transformation, it seems, needs the science of alchemy, which adopts the logic of connectedness, cooked by the fire of respect and recognition of ourselves and others. But where does this logic of connectedness lead us to? It leads us to the ethics of forgiveness, which is the act of purity and innocence. Human beings always have residues that disturbs the tranquility of their souls. We know that. We all have residues, we all have negatives, we all have shit in our lives. So, the job of education is to clean up these residues. That is why the emphasis must be on character education. That is virtue education. From virtue education, everything follows naturally. Prospero dominates the island by the magic of the enchantment. The Tempest was a contrivance and makes the sufferings of the ship passengers arouse the compassion of Miranda. This was an illusion. Prospero says in Act 2, Scene 2, my high charms work, and there mine enemies are all knit up in their distractions. The paradox is that the use of illusion is not to mislead, but to lead the truth. But lead to the truth. The love of Miranda and Ferdinand, the reasonable awareness of the evil that was done to Prospero and his daughter Miranda, and by his brother Antonio. And finally, the ultimate forgiveness for all. This shows that knowledge, when not led by purity and innocence, leads to a misleading pleasures and disturbing results. That is why Prospero drowned his books as if they were human beings. The truth is above knowledge and above illusion. As if Shakespeare teaches us that we are both made up of illusion as well as of reality. This is very much Freudian. No wonder why Freud said that Shakespeare was the psychologist. Yes. We need to dispel illusions and settle with our own reality that we are ignorant of. We are much greater than we think we are. That is why we are oftentimes stranger to ourselves. Gonzalo says that they all found themselves when no one was his own. this does not stop here. They all found themselves even in an island that is not their own. It is the island that could represent the discovery of the New World. This New World that brought the Europeans another dimension of humanity. Human beings with different style, manners, and tact. The difference found in the New World is what defines ourselves as we all belong to humanity. It was the time Shakespeare suggested for transformation. But this transformation cannot take place without realizing the nature of this passing world. Prospero says, "These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which inherit shall dissolve, and leave no wreck behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." All the characters in the play realized how at the basis of calamities, there is a hidden goodness. There is purity and there is innocence as well. Ferdinand says, "Though the seas threatens, they are merciful. I have cursed them without a cause." Again, I repeat that Prospero drowned his books as if he drowned the bases he built his illusions on. The residues that eclipse the inner nobility of the human beings. After his exile on an unknown island, Prospero, knowing this new world, allowed it to transform him into a forgiving person by the purification of his intellect and the cleansing of the infected residues of all his psychological elements. Like Sophocles, Philoctetus, he glorifies his life by embracing all the negative and the positive elements that invaded him. Prospero ends with this graceful forgiveness. Now, I hate these papers. Now I want spirits to enforce and to enchant. And my ending is despair unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. O brave new world that has such people in it, will ever Miranda, this innocent young woman, join the curriculum of our contemporary education? Ha ha ha, it won't happen. Will ever forgiveness glorify our lives? Will we ever escort the teaching of skills, communication, facts, and arguments with forgiveness? I wonder. Let's wait and see. It will happen someday. Humanity cannot be conquered. And the time will come when we all join Shakespeare in Act 5, Scene 1, saying, their understanding begins to swell, and the approaching tide will shortly fill the reasonable shore that now lies foul and muddy. Thank you.
Now David Mosley will follow.
while these are being distributed, I would like to make just a few remarks. First of all, my thanks to Alan, who 4 years ago invited me to present a paper and exposed me, introduced me to an organization that I've really come to appreciate. And it's the kind of organization that I feel as if whatever I can give to it will be returned in at least twofold. I'm not sure whether the paper I am about to read is complementary to our concerns or wrong-headed or simply out of date, but we'll see. It's a paper that has had a life of its own. It's had at least 4 iterations, and last night it had a 5th iteration, and so I'll be reading from my legal pad. It began as a pedagogical case study based on this very wonderful novella, The Entanglements of Master Torlis. Unfortunately translated The Confusions of Young Torlis. This is a young man who is a student at a military academy at the turn of the last century. And it's an account of his, well, it's an anti-Bildungsroman, if you will. Then the paper became a discovery of the relation between Robert Musil and Ernst Cassirer, who is a very important, though neglected, philosopher of culture. And it turned into almost a kind of historical study, and I found that the two likely did have some contact with one another, although it's not been discussed. Then it became a teasing apart of the philosophy of education of Ernst Cassirer, which I found compelling in as much as he views it as a tragic enterprise. And now finally I'm returning to the pedagogical case study. Musil's novella is an account of a young adolescent male in a military boarding school in the far provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the last century. His name is Torlis. This is his family name. We never learn his given name. He is a sensitive, perhaps overly sensitive, naive, thoughtful young man who spends his first weeks at school suffering from a crippling homesickness. This changes, however, when he forges a bond with 2 of his fellow students after a farcical visit to the local prostitute. For Torlis, the sexual nature of this adventure coalesces with his relation to his classmates, and this leads to the ritual torture and sexual abuse of a 4th student. Sunny novella, isn't it? At first, Torlis is an uncomfortable spectator. However, he eventually becomes a participant, a willing participant. In an attempt to make sense of this experience, Torlis begins to keep a diary. Yet shortly after the attempt to make sense of his experiences in words, he realizes that language has failed him, that language fails to mediate between his experiences and his emotions. And here I direct your attention to the quotations numbers 6, 7, and 8 on the 3rd page of the handout. Soon after this, in math class, Torlis encounters the equation for affinity and the concept of imaginary numbers. And it has stretched my woefully inadequate education in mathematics to come to grips with just what imaginary numbers are, but they are square roots of 0 that somehow yield real numbers. They begin with imaginary numbers and yield real numbers. This encounter with the equation for infinity and imaginary numbers undermines Torlis's confidence in the ability to make a clear distinction between what is real and what is imaginary. And here I direct your attention to quotes 5 and 9. Now, as intimated earlier, the entangles of Torlis parallel, in my mind, the 3 symbolic forms outlined in Ernst Cassirer's critical philosophy of culture. Cassirer, an enthusiastic neo-Kantian, contends that we come to know the external world of objects and events by means of mythic, linguistic, and numerical symbolic systems. Like Kant, Cassirer is careful to avoid the claim that the external world is a product of our own subjective fantasy. Rather, he believes that the only worlds we can encounter as human beings that are meaningful for us are ones constituted according to these three forms of symbolic apprehension. As Cassirer has it, these symbolic forms allow us to, quote, arrange, articulate, and organize the content of experience and intuition. I'm going to skip over some things here. Cassirer's conception of Bildung, the ultimate aim of his latent philosophy of education, that was one form of the paper that I'm presenting. He defines Bildung as the coming to consciousness of the creative role one plays in the shaping of our social experience. And I'm not sure whether this is profound or dangerous. Let me say again, for Cassirer, Bildung is the coming to consciousness of the creative role one plays in the shaping of our social experience. At the same time, however, as Cassirer articulates this definition of Bildung, he acknowledges that our experience of the external world, according to any one of these symbolic forms, has a built-in tension between the seeming stability of the mythical, linguistic, or mathematical objects we've intuited out there and the object's own inherent tendency to expand into the other realms of symbolic, into the other symbolic forms. In a late essay, Cassirer calls this tension the tragedy of culture, and offers up that the only response to this dissonance is one of ironic distance. That Tourlis fails to achieve Bildung, whether as defined by Cassirer or in terms of any number of other classical conceptions of the idea, is the fault of both the institution and its faculty. And here things become personal. About 2/3 of the way into the novella, Musil describes a conversation between Tourlis and his maths instructor. We are told that Tourlis had misgivings about initiating the meeting, essentially showing up for office hours, if you will. That he had a natural reticence about exposing his own confusions. That he had a hesitancy to show himself as an engaged student. In the end, however, it is the curiosity of Tourlis about the instructor's own personality outside the classroom and about the personal domain in which he dwells that compel Tourlis to have the conversation. The description of the meeting between Tourlis and his teacher reads like my worst professional nightmare. And this is number 10 on your handout. And could I borrow? I don't have one of my own handouts. I'd like to read it as cringingly as I will. The teacher rocked back and forth impatiently in his seat. Now shall we, will you, I'm happy to give you any information you might need. Tourlis set out his reservations. This is about the equation for infinity, about imaginary numbers, and tried to explain their significance for him. I'm glad, my dear Tourlis, I really am very glad. Your concerns show that you are serious. They show evidence of independent thought, but it isn't easy to give you an explanation you're after. To be strictly scientific, I would have to set out preconditions that you would barely understand, and we haven't time for that anyway. At the elementary stage of education, which is where you are at the present, it is very difficult to find the correct explanation for many of the things you will encounter. You must simply believe. In terms of Cassirer's philosophy of education, the instructor in Musil's novella demonstrates the deficiencies of his own Bildung when he fails to model an ironic distance from his discipline. a distance that might prompt him to ask the student why the question is a question for him in the first place. As unpleasant and confounding as writing this paper has been, I have come to the conviction that before I present my description of a discipline, before I teach a discipline, before I thematize it in the academy, before I expose the ways philosophy is always already a political instrument, before any of those things, I should somehow personalize my pedagogy. Somehow I must expose myself as a self, ready to recognize the selves of my students. Thank you.
So, looking ahead, I want to let you know that we're saving the best for last. I think it's exciting. In the tradition of, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, Richard, I think you remember this, when we would end the conference with an undergraduate student panel. Do you remember those? And so after, my paper is going to seam into an introduction of Zach Rohrbach, who just graduated from Wabash College and is presently a student teacher, preparing to become a physics teacher, who will be sharing an assignment he did in a philosophy of education class. So this, in some sense, will have some, this is a case study in a perhaps more literal sense. My paper title on the program is Pastoral Philosophy and Other Fairy Tales. And I take pastoral philosophy in 2 ways. The first way in which I use the word pastoral is in the sense of storytelling, in the sense of the shepherds, in the sense of folklore. And I take folklore to be the primary domain of history. Story, for me, is at the center of history. So in one sense, pastoral philosophy is a sense of philosophy that is historiographic, but historiographic with a concern for folklore, for myth, for poesis, for those things at the middle. On the other side of pastoral philosophy is also the pastoral in the sense of the ministerial, the rabbinic, the prophetic, the spiritual, the theological. And the fairy tale I'm going to tell you is a fairy tale about the end of constructivism and a return to the teacher-centered classroom. So this is this fairy tale which we all know we can't imagine, and we all know is strictly forbidden. And so I'm just going to tell you this very funny fairy tale, which also occurs as an intervention into present-day continental philosophy between Giorgio Agamben, Carl Schmitt, Slavoj Žižek, and Boris Gunievich, and me. So the subtitle is A Historical and Theological Account of Teacher Authority. That's the title of the fairy tale. In Carl Schmitt's political theology, politics are described in 2 ways that are fundamentally theological. The first is their ontological dependence upon the sovereign. He says, he who decides the exception. The second we find in a statement, quote, all significant concepts of modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, but also because of their systematic structure. This second point begins a chronological description of the historical place and systematic belief structure of the sovereign within modernity. The resulting taxonomy is analogic, and it goes as follows. So this is Schmitt's taxonomy of modernity. 1, monarchism is to monotheism, as 2, liberalism is to deism, as 3, socialism is to pantheism or vitalism. Whereas a conflict between the first and second categories shapes the history of early modernity and the 17th and 18th centuries, this is, of course, the well-known feud between the monotheism of monarchism and the deism of liberalism, early classical liberalism. Think this in terms of Burke versus Mill or something like that. In the 19th century, a pantheistic socialism or vitalistic communitarianism emerges. Therefore, in the late 19th and early 20th century, an alliance between liberals and socialists vanquishes monarchists forever. Deism and pantheism overtake monotheism. What we are left with now, in the present, then, is without the possibility for true kings, only despots and dictators like Hitler, those who are not sovereign in the sense that a king would be sovereign, And so they create alternative spaces, which in a little bit we'll call nomos, the nomos of the camp, like Hitler's camp, like Stalin's camp. Despots and dictators who profess a secularized theology within the liberal/socialist tradition. So that's Schmidt. Now to Agamben. In Homo Sacer, Giorgio Agamben draws heavily from Schmidt for his descriptive account of sovereignty, what he calls the paradox of sovereignty. But his consideration of the historical implications for his notion of sovereignty is not approached through a Schmittian lens. So he puts Schmidt behind after he establishes the sovereign. For this, he relies on Foucault's history of sexuality and its seemingly complementary notion of vita necessque potestas, operationalizing the Schmittian emphasis of the exception into Agamben's notion of the law, and furthermore, the evolution of the Homo Sacer from Roman law to the juridical structure of the camp, the modern, the gulag, the work camp, the Shoah. The biopolitical paradigm of the modern. That's Agamben's words. So here's where my critique begins. Agamben's mix and match line of reasoning here, where he mixes Schmidt with Foucault, is perhaps too simple. Unlike Schmidt's historical analysis, the taxonomy I introduced in part 1, Agamben via Foucault does not account for the contestation for the temporal site and theological articulation of sovereignty within modernity. We can only understand, quote, the camp as the nomos of modernity. By nomos, here it's a contested concept, but it generally refers to the relationship between order and space. And so Agamben calls this the camp as the nomos of modernity. He theorizes the camp as the temporal, orderly site of the modern. Right? I claim that we can only understand that concept when we understand the political theology that makes the camp itself possible within modernity. In fact, partly because of his hybrid approach, we also find significant distance between Schmidt's earlier notion of nomos and Agamben's. Whereas Schmidt's sense of nomos, on grand display in his book, The Nomos of the Earth, is primarily a question of order and spatiality, Agamben's follows Foucault more closely, becoming genealogical and paradigmatic. In this respect, it's almost Kuhnian. This has, in other words, Agamben's treatment of the camp, has been widely critiqued because he sees it as a structure or paradigm rather than a thing with a history. But I'm not concerned with this particular critique. My critique will move even further from the desirable camp as image, the desire to take the camp out of structures and put it into more personal space, and move into the camp as icon, the theological order of the spatiality of the camp, which I claim is an apt way to envision today's classrooms. The nomos, the relationship between order and space, which provides the order and orientation within which the question of teacher authority emerges. 4. Zizek and Gunievich. In a very recent book published in English, God is in Pain, Slavoj Zizek and Boris Gunievich moved from Zizek's theological interlocution with John Milbank in the book The Monstrosity of Christ through a compelling conversation about the failures of the left, reminiscent of some of our conversations yesterday, in recent modern history, understood as a disastrous inability to account for the theological. To be more precise, in connection with Schmidt, they're talking about the failure to account, as Nietzsche did, for the political demise of monarchy and monotheism, that is to say, the political death of God. Gunievich shows Lenin's failure to understand the mystagogy of revolution, those are his words, embedded in the proletariat's call for the eternal reign of workers and peasants. He tells this fascinating story about how Lenin walked in to give a speech, and there were workers there with signs saying, may peasants and workers reign forever, or something like that. And he just completely didn't know. Apparently he was shocked, and he amended his talk to talk about how weird it was and how they needed to be more strictly adhering, very reminiscent of some of your very close readings of this. This failure, Gunievich argues, fails to capture the failure of the revolution itself and carries Gunievich to reconsider the implications of radical orthodoxy for a revolution capable of bringing about the demise of capitalism. For Zizek, however, the connection to the nomos of the camp is crystal clear, and this is a quote from Zizek. Therein lies the theological significance of the Shoah. Although it is usually conceived as the ultimate challenge to theology. If there is a God, and if he is good, how could he allow such a horror to take place? It is, at the same time, only theology that can provide the frame enabling us to somehow approach the scope of the catastrophe. The fiasco of God is still the fiasco of God. End quote. So this next section begins the demise of the teacher. It is precisely in this gap, the gap I've built, the gap between Agamben's use of Schmittian sovereignty and his shift away from Schmitt towards Foucauldian biopower. This place is where I want to place the substance of my critique. In the theological in-between, where Agamben leaves Schmitt behind and, if Zizek and Gunievich are right, and I think they are, succumbs to the quintessential modern mistake, the mistake of theological illiteracy. In this liminal space, we find the absence of Schmitt's theological consideration of history through his chronological taxonomy of monotheism, deism, and pantheism. Could it be that the contested and vexing question of teacher authority, certainly a question we're asking, and certainly itself a question of sovereignty, might also be lost in Agamben's Foucauldian biopolitical reading of the objectification of the subject into bare life as homo sacer? Homo sacer, while it is literally translated as sacred man, Agamben is talking about it from Roman juridical law, where to be homo sacer was to be eligible to be killed. So the homo sacer was the exception in Roman juridical law. It is very clear that Agamben himself secularizes the sacred, not through the profane, itself a form of sacrifice that maintains its place as sacred, but through the law. Agamben, as I said, is thoroughly juridical. No wonder his appeal to biopolitics cannot fully account for the camp as nomos of modernity, without subsequently diluting the nomos of nomos. He fails to understand the theological structure of nomos, its history, its story, its folklore, the pastoral dimension. That is to say, the relationship between order and place that produces the relationship between order and space, nomos. In the very same way, the teacher, the rabbinic professing magister, has been placed under Agamben's Foucauldian specter of the law. Anybody who's felt the pinch of No Child Left Behind or accreditation boards surely knows this. However, as I have shown, this place has not been displaced by the law pure and simple. Nomos itself transacts between order and spatiality. Unlike the theological and historical nomos of the law itself, until the theological and historical nomos of the law itself, and in this sense, Schmitt's notion of sovereignty is itself exceptional to theology, in that it to the theology it inhabits, as there is no order in it to the degree that there is in the nomos of the world, which precisely is why Zizek maintains via Lacan that modern atheists all believe in God. Until this historical political nomos can be accounted for as fully as possible, only until then, we cannot make any sense whatsoever of proletariats holding signs of the eternal reign of workers and peasants, or the perverse possibility of the Shoah, the Gulag, the camp of the classroom. In other words, the question of teacher authority is not available in Agamben's Homo Sacer because the notion of sacredness for Agamben is juridical, not theological, thereby lacking the insight to see inside the phenomenological thing itself, the teacher, the sovereign. With Schmitt, however, we find a path where the authority of the teacher exists within the nomos of a theological conception of history that understands, perhaps morbidly, that the only teacher with sovereignty, the monotheistic teacher, has been brought to her death under the combined reign of liberal and socialist political theologies, which is to say, Dewey, which I would consider to be the philosopher par excellence of this socialist liberal political theology, killed the teacher through constructivism. This is my argument. So my response to this is Trinitarian resurrection/insurrection. Is this completely true? course not. Schmidt's original analysis finds itself lacking. However, the primary point of this fairy tale is that Schmidt is not lacking to the same degree that Agamben is. So that's my main point. Much like Zizek, again in God is in Pain, his critique of Jean-Luc Marion's three forms of sacrifice, where Zizek adds a predictably Lacanian fourth to complete the set, so too with my ending critique of Schmidt. Schmidt's understanding of monotheism is itself incomplete, theologically unsophisticated, and too wedded to a purely political reading of history. In this regard, Schmidt's political theology is too political, in the same way that Agamben's is too juridical. Schmidt has a rather Davidic pre-Christian sense of monotheism, very monotheistic, right? That lends itself very well to Agamben's juridical obsession, where the law is singular, right? In fact, Schmidt's own theological account fails for the exact same reason as Agamben's failure to acknowledge it. Schmidt, too, misses the mystical element, the Trinity. Where in these three theological accounts, monotheism, deism, pantheism, does one place a God who is one in three and three in one? More radically, following Zizek, where does one place a God who admits to being an atheist? Right? This is the question. Right? This is the question. And how does one account for the tremendous difference between the actual theological question of the sovereign between the Trinitarian theologies of the East and the West? The filioque, the great source of the key source of the great schism of 1054, a truly historical and literal, in this sense, historical change within the nomos of the West. No question that after 1054, the West is changed forever in order and space and all the things to follow. This most difficult case of the Trinity and of the atheist God is absent in Schmidt, and perhaps to join the ranks of Zizek and Guniewicz precisely in this absence, we bear great hope for late modernity, for the present. Despite the political death of God at the end of the 19th century, the death that killed kings and teachers forever, there may still be a theology so radical it cannot be imagined as possible. The return of Christianity under a new form of theological sovereignty, a dark, Trinitarian, negative theological politics. Whereas Zizek and many others within theological Marxism these days understand this hope in terms of its use to oppose capitalism. So Zizek is very upfront of his very utilitarian interests in theology. Mine are a bit different. I see it not so much as a tool against capitalism, but Tom, feel free to use it that way, right? I see it as a way to recover the teacher that we cannot recover without a radical theological turn. This is the teacher that Biesta has begun to imagine as possible very recently, within the last year, as possible when we, quote, make some room for transcendence. His argument is that constructivism has emptied the act of teaching of transcendence, and that this is why No Child Left Behind has filled that gap with law and with structure and with standards and with tests and all these things. But before we, and perhaps just I, get too excited, we should be reminded that, following my critique of Agamben and more implicitly of Schmidt, this reality is itself hidden beneath an ahistorical, secular rejection of the theological politics of sovereignty. Recovery of the former must precede dreams about the latter, and both will prove invaluable for any serious historical and theological account of teacher authority, which is the fairy tale I tried to share. So next up, sit down. I'm the sovereign. Next up, I'm really proud and really happy to end our conference with a student giving us some work. This project, just for pedagogical function, in my classes of philosophy of education, I've given different final assignments, but for a long time I've used assignment where we read kind of chronologically, historically, but we also consider the question of miseducation, both from Dewey, from Carter G. Woodson, and even from Lauryn Hill. The final assignment is to ask them to write, where the prompt is the title, and the title is The Miseducation of, and they put their name in the gap. And so they write their own sort of miseducation. So it's a form of autobiography. Zach went well beyond all expectations. This is the exception. So you're sovereign in that sense, according to Agamben. But I'm really excited to share with you and have him share with us his work. So welcome, Zach Rohrbach.
Yeah, so I do come at this like a little bit differently because I'm not a philosopher. I'm a high school teacher, and a high school teacher of physics at that. So that's where, and this is kind of an autobiography of my philosophical, or sort of the philosophical autobiography. Okay. Throughout much of my life, I've been miseducated to believe in education as what John Dewey has called the quest for certainty. The goal of knowledge is being to achieve certain understanding of the world. And I contend now that such a view of education and knowledge is an impoverished view of education and knowledge, and an impoverished view of truth, because truth, although, here's my claim, truth, although not relative, is uncertain. It is not some nice and neat set of axioms and logic that can be fit into one's mind, but truth, I will eventually argue, is something that is beyond comprehension, and education fails when it pretends, as it often does, that truth is anything less than this. To pretend that we can fully comprehend truth is both gravely arrogant and wholly undesirable and empty. But this paper will not be an indictment of knowledge in education, but a sole defense of it. So I'm going to begin by showing how I believed I acquired the flawed conception of education, the flawed conception of knowledge, and the flawed conception of truth. And then I will discuss why I have changed my view and why I view these things as incorrect. Okay, so my two biggest academic interests are science and math. Math, at its core, is something quite different from science. And although originally, in my miseducation, I didn't realize this, where science observes and draws conclusions about something outside of itself, namely the natural order, mathematics observes itself and draws its own conclusions. So, for example, a mathematical theorem is proven by mathematics. A scientific law is only proven by observing nature, observing something outside of itself. And even then, it's even a little bit more complicated because a scientific law is never truly proven. It's only proven insofar as it's not disproven by an experiment. So in one sense, then, I would say that science is a higher art than mathematics because science requires the scientist to submit his work to be judged by a higher authority. As Richard Feynman said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. On the other hand, mathematical ideas can always be right, at least insofar as they're not self-contradictory. For example, the mathematics of the sort of controversial field in physics right now of string theory, the mathematics are self-consistent, so it is a mathematically correct theory. But it is not necessarily a scientifically correct theory because it doesn't make predictions that can be proven or disproven by experiment. Okay, so let's take this idea a step further. So I propose now, based upon what I just said, that science is an uncertain art, whereas mathematics is a certain art. Science looks at nature and then prescribes laws that seem to explain nature most of the time. But every scientist knows that the laws of nature that we have developed are an imperfect and an unfinished understanding of reality. So the scientist's knowledge is incomplete and uncertain, where math, on the other hand, is certain. Why? Because a mathematician knows that, on no uncertain terms, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And it equals that today. Tomorrow, 2 plus 2 is going to equal 4. And from the end of time, from back to the Greeks, 2 plus 2 has always been 4. There is no uncertainty here. And whenever you prove a mathematical theorem, it's always correct. There's no uncertainty. It's a precise thing. So, in my own life then, and I think that this is a general trend, I began to conflate this mathematical understanding and this idea of mathematics with science. And so this is understandable given the very close relationship between math and science. And in my own subject area, physics, a lot of times a physics class looks a lot like a math class. But I want to look at what I did to the philosophy of science, in that I began to view the answer, the scientific answer, as the answer. There was no uncertainty to it. It was a mathematical certainty. Whenever there was an uncertainty in science, like for example, if I do a lab and I don't know for sure what my, I do my experiment several times, I get slightly different numbers, so I'm uncertain. But that uncertainty is usually viewed not really as uncertainty, but just as a measure of how far we are away from the certainty. So it's not a real uncertainty, it's just a lack of certainty. So the way then I viewed science was as a quest to minimize this uncertainty in order to approach the uncertainty. Okay. Now, I'm not here necessarily to give you an overview of the philosophy of science, but it's an overview that's important to my story because it seemed obvious to me that if we take this beyond math and science to philosophy, morality, metaphysics, religion, pedagogy, educational theory, whatever it is that you want to say, that these were simply extensions of science. They were merely domains of the same scientific truth. And maybe it's true. Maybe these things are extensions of the domain of scientific truth. But for the moment, I'm not particularly interested in whether that's the case. I'm more interested in the fact that I viewed each of these areas as areas that, given enough thinking and deliberating, could be explained with certainty. In other words, I was beginning to conflate an idea of absolute truth with an idea of absolute certainty. The purpose of education for me then was to get as close as I possibly could to certainty. Okay. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that anything I've said up to this point is wrong necessarily, but I am convinced it's got the emphasis in the wrong place. Okay, so I have a quote here from Nicholas Berbulis from The Tragic Sense of Education, in which he says, quote, "The culprit here is what John Dewey called the quest for certainty, the hope for knowledge that is clear, uncontroversial, and unchanging. From this vantage point, uncertainty is seen as bad, as something to get rid of. Most people grasp at the nearest plausible rationale rather than struggle with their doubt. Such an attitude is, I believe, hostile to the process of education in which uncertainty and doubt are inevitable," unquote. So my miseducation then was in that I viewed education as this quest for certainty. But why is this bad? So Dewey reminds us in Experience and Education that freedom is not valuable. Freedom is something that's not valuable for its own sake, but it's something that's valuable only when it is oriented towards some sort of good. If we were to apply this same test to education and knowledge, the question becomes, what good is education and knowledge oriented towards? Is it oriented towards the good of certainty? Well, I want to think about this. If I were able to gain certainty, if I were Hitler and I were able to gain certainty on the best way to ethnically cleanse the Third Reich, is that good? And I think the answer is no. I hope the answer is no. So, certainty is not the good that education is striving for. Instead, education shouldn't be a quest for certainty, it should be a quest for good. But in order to know what is truly good, there has to be some sort of a quest for truth then. So now we see, because we can't have something, if there's something that's not truly good, for example, if Hitler has his soldiers thinking that they are committing an act of charity to the future so-called Aryans by ethnically cleansing the world, that's obviously not true. So you have to have an idea of truth in order to be able to achieve good. So education has to be, in part, something that is after truth. So at this point, it may seem like I've contradicted myself because I earlier said that good education is not necessarily a quest for certainty, but now I have said that good education includes a quest for truth. So how do we go about this? Well, I want to say that truth is not equivalent to certainty. As a matter of fact, I want to go a step further and say that truth itself is uncertain. Not uncertain in a cheap epistemological way in which we are not sure what the truth is, but in a rigorous ontological way. And to begin this point, I'm going to go talk about my discussion about how my perception of science was miseducated. Okay, I made my claim before that my perception of physics was an attempt to minimize the uncertainties so that we can arrive with certainty at a physical law. And obviously this can't become true when we start to talk about quantum mechanics, which is built on the foundational principle of the uncertainty principle. The idea that we can't know for certain, one way to say it, we can't know for certain where an object is and how fast it's moving at the same time. So then at its very foundation, physics is not actually, it can't be something that's certain because at its very foundation, physics has this uncertainty principle. Uncertainty is built into nature. It is not something, it is not merely a byproduct of human imperfection. I posit that truth in general behaves in this way. For example, and this is kind of a trivial example, but it is absolutely wrong to neglect a child. But there are many ways, and I would say that is therefore uncertain, on how to do good to that child. So start on the first order. You could feed him well and play games with him and read to him. You can do that with a two-parent household. You can do that with a parent and a grandparent. You can do that if you're a single mother, if it's an adoption or foster care services. When it comes to discipline, you can spank your child, or you can opt for less corporally severe methods. These are areas where it's uncertain what it is correct to do. And this, as I said, is a superficial example of what I'm going to read now, a quote from William James, and what he points out here. So here's a quote. The science, and these scare quotes are mine, and I'll explain them in a second. But the science of logic never made man reason rightly, and the science of ethics, if there be such a thing, never made man behave rightly. The most such sciences can do is help us catch ourselves up and check ourselves. If we start to reason or to behave wrongly, and to criticize ourselves more accurately after we have made a mistake. A science only lays down lines within which the rules of the art must fall. Laws which the follower of the art must not transgress. But what particular thing he should do positively within those lines is left exclusively to his own genius. One genius will do his work well and succeed in one way, while another succeeds as well quite differently. Yet neither will transgress the lines. Unquote. Okay, there is not, James is telling us here, one certain pedagogical method, one certain moral action, one certain answer to any given situation. But that's not to say that this isn't relativism. This is not to say that there is no such thing as absolute education, absolute morality, absolute truth. So, for example, we could use truth as reason through, for example, a natural law theory to help us learn the difference between right and wrong. But there will always be, there will not always be an easy, certain decision to make when it comes to a complex moral dilemma where parts of the natural law contradict itself. Truth does not bow to mortal man's intellect by merely giving way to simple certainty. Truth is something that is much more simple and beautiful than that. Or, I'm sorry, that is much more subtle and beautiful than that. So, I talked about these scare quotes I was putting into William James's quote above. I want to explain those. So when I put the word science in square quotes, I did that because the way James is using the term was different than I defined the term science at the beginning of the paper. Remember that I said that science is something that gets its confirmation from nature, whereas math gets confirmation from itself. And so in this definitional framework, James's sciences of logic and ethics are really more mathematical in nature than they are scientific in nature. And this is just as like Newton's scientific laws of motion would really be more like mathematical laws of motion. So they only become science insofar as they conform with something outside of themselves, namely truth. So if James were to use the same terminology I am using, he would say that the genius is one who recognizes the inherent mathematical nature of the sciences of logic and ethics and is able to, without transgressing the theorems and parameters of them, reach out beyond them into the truth that is utterly more complicated and uncertain than can entirely be expressed by any mathematical description. The genius to whom James is referring to is a true scientist. He uses mathematics, but he does not take mathematics to be the sum total of truth. The truth which is infinitely more beautiful, subtle, and uncertain than mathematics in its certainty could ever approach. Good education, then, is in part the formation of a scientist. education as the formation of a mathematician is incomplete. So then we get back to the, so then we get back to the question of my own miseducation. As a child, I had this fascination with how the world works, and that's what got me into science in the first place. I had a fascination, in other words, with truth, the truth of the world. I was a scientist. But at some point in taking these mathematical science classes, my fascination and awe with reality was packaged and sterilized into a desire to discover the certainty that supposedly governed nature. I became a mathematician. My awe at nature was transformed into a vain faith in some sort of order that saw truth merely as something that could be contained within my own intellect, or at the very least, collectively within the intellect of the human family. So as such, then, I viewed education to be this acquiring of the truth and fitting it into my own mind. And even now, I have presented this hopefully rousing defense of the uncertainty of truth. But to what end have I done this? Because insofar as this is a talk, it has to be a mathematical theorem. What I've just given you is a mathematical theorem. Is it right? Well, I believe it to be right. But the only way that I could ever be sure of that is to do my own experiments, by living to see if, by living like this, to see if this is anything more than just a cutesy intellectual exercise. So then, perhaps I could call myself a scientist in this regard. But even if what I've said is right, and even if I do these experiments and I become this scientist, I'm still not a good person. And if I am only good insofar as I can accomplish good, as we've been talking about some of this conference, then a scientific understanding of truth is entirely meaningless, or, to go along with what Joseph just said, perhaps even of negative value, if it does not do anything good. The last step of doing good is not something that can be accomplished merely by writing a paper, by giving a talk, by going to school. It is something that must be actively lived.